This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 335 entitled Avoiding the Straw Man Fallacy. Yes, this is going to be the first of probably 20 or so episodes on the topic of logical fallacies. Specifically, the logical fallacies that are commonly used in discussions and debates about God and Jesus. The goal of this series of podcasts is to help listeners, whether they are Unitarians, Arians, or Trinitarians, it is to help them better understand how logic is supposed to work in order that we can be more successful in our discussions, in our teachings, and in our evangelism. Those that are interested in debating God and Jesus professionally or even casually will find a lot of value in this episode and in the subsequent episodes, because you will be able to identify problems in your own logic so that you can avoid using those, and you'll also be able to point out when your opponent uses these fallacies. My aim and hope is that listeners will come to recognize when they commit these fallacies by identifying them, defining them, and choosing intentionally to no longer use these fallacies when they talk with others. So this week's episode will begin our series with one of the most common logical fallacies out there, namely the straw man fallacy. As we will soon see, the straw man fallacy is when we misrepresent, either intentionally or unintentionally, the position of our opponent. And this misrepresentation effectively makes the argument look silly or fairly easy to defeat. And when an argument looks easy to defeat, it's pretty easy to knock it down. But if we are able to steelman an argument, something that we're going to talk about later in this episode, that is actually an argument that is far more difficult to topple. So, what are some of the common straw man arguments? How can we identify when we and others use the straw man? Why is the straw man unhelpful in dialogues about God and Jesus? And how should we debate and discuss theology instead of strawmanning the arguments of our opponents? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is defining the straw man fallacy. So we have to make sure that we are all on the same page in regard to the definition of this particular fallacy before we can look at some examples and we can discuss how to avoid using it. So, the straw man fallacy is a common type of argumentative fallacy where someone misrepresents or oversimplifies another person's argument in order to make it easier to refute or to attack. So instead of addressing the actual argument, a person constructs a straw man version of it that is distorted and weaker, and then he goes on to knock down this weaker argument instead of the actual argument, and in doing so, the person claims to have defeated the original argument. So this is how the straw man fallacy works. It's going to begin with a distortion. The original argument is exaggerated or misrepresented in some sort of way. And as I mentioned earlier, this could be either intentional or unintentional. You can take a statement out of context. You can attribute extreme positions to your opponent's argument, or you can take a complex argument and you can simplify it in a way that is a oversimplification. After you've distorted it, the straw man argument is going to attack that distortion as opposed to attacking the actual argument. The distorted version is then refuted, and because this new version is weaker or far more extreme, it is obviously much easier to criticize or refute. And in turn, the person who makes the straw man fallacy is going to claim victory. After they attack the straw man, they think that they have refuted the original argument, even though they didn't actually engage the original argument directly. They have engaged a different argument, an exaggerated argument, a weaker argument. And so their claim of victory is not legitimate. So let me give you a good example that's not in the realm of theology or biblical studies. So imagine someone says that a balanced diet should include a variety of foods, including vegetables. That's their argument. A balanced diet should include a variety of foods, including vegetables. Now, if I wanted to straw man that argument, I could say that, well, my opponent wants us to eat nothing but vegetables and to give up all other foods. And so I would attack it by saying that such a diet is unbalanced and it's unhealthy. But I haven't actually engaged the original argument. The original argument said that a balanced diet should include a variety of foods, including vegetables, but I just latched on to the mention of vegetables, and I have distorted what they said, and I have attributed to them things that they didn't say. I have made it much easier, as if they say that you should only eat vegetables and nothing else, and of course that would be unhealthy and unbalanced. So that's what I've done. I have straw-manned the original argument, and I have not engaged that argument in a way that is loving. I have not engaged that argument in a way that is charitable, and I've certainly not engaged that argument in a way that the person who made the argument would assume that I have listened to them in a way that is respectful. They would walk away saying that they have not been heard and that their argument has not been reasonably engaged. And no one likes feeling that way. No one likes it when that is done to us, and we have to make it a point to not strawman other people. So, why is the strawman fallacy extremely problematic? Why should we avoid this? Well, number one, it's very misleading because it creates a false impression of the position of the opponent, and it's going to lead to further misunderstandings. It is also an unfair representation of what the other person is trying to say. It is actually intellectually dishonest to that person who has taken the time to set forth an argument when we distort it and when we misrepresent it. So it's misleading, it's unfair, and it's also unproductive because it hinders the dialogue and the debate process from moving forward. It keeps the conversation from being constructive, and it really leaves the arguments unaddressed. We're not actually dealing with the arguments that are laid forth. So the straw man fallacy is problematic because it's unproductive, it's unfair, and it's misleading. All right, so having defined the straw man fallacy, let's look at common straw man arguments that are used in Christological debates. This is our second point, point number 2, common straw man fallacies in Christological discussions. So I want to use some common straw man arguments that are used on both sides of the Trinitarian Biblical Unitarian debate, because both sides are guilty of doing this. And so if these are arguments that you make, I would encourage you to discontinue using them and to find more charitable ways of engaging your opponent, because Jesus taught that we should love our neighbor as ourselves, and we should not do to another person what we would not desire for them to do to us. So here is a common straw man argument in Christological debates. Quote, "The Trinity is a complex doctrine that emphasizes one God in three persons." That is a phrase that a Trinitarian might use. And so if I wanted to straw man that, what I would say is that, well, my opponent believes in three gods. And three gods is just polytheism. And polytheism is incompatible with the monotheistic faith. And so this belief is clearly unbiblical. What I've done is I've taken their argument where they say there's one God in three persons, and I've said, well, that's actually polytheism. But that's not the argument that they actually made. I need to engage them with the language that they use. They said that there's one God in three persons. They didn't say that there were three gods. Now, I might have insinuated something about that, but I have distorted what they are actually saying. So that's one common straw man argument that gets used. Let's kind of flip the script and let's show a common straw man argument that is used against Biblical Unitarians. Maybe you've heard this one. I get this one at least once a week. So the argument that Biblical Unitarians will say is that Jesus Christ, Jesus the Jewish Messiah, is a human being. He's a man and a member of the human race. And so they will straw man us by saying that my opponent thinks that Jesus is a mere man. He's just a mere man, a mere mortal. And so they would attack that straw man by saying, no mere man could do the things that only God can do, like forgive sins, give life, walk on water, and perform all of these other miracles. So Jesus can't be a mere man. He must be God. And that is a straw man attack. I didn't say that Jesus is the mere man. I said that Jesus is the Christ, which means that he is the anointed Messiah. He's been anointed by God, and that he is a member of the human race. And of course, if you are the Christ, if you are the anointed Messiah, you are nothing mere. You are the one that has been anointed and empowered by the one who anoints. That, of course, is God. So it is wrong to assume that by claiming that Jesus Christ is a human, that he is just a mere man or a mere mortal. There's nothing mere about Jesus. Okay, let's flip the script. What is another common straw man that is used against Trinitarians? Well, people will say that Trinitarians think that God and Jesus are the same. God and Jesus are the same. Now, this is an oversimplistic misrepresentation of their position, but this is pretty common. This is something that I hear sometimes in Sunday school, that's just what Trinitarians say. And that's not actually true. That's not their position. Their position would be that there is one God, and that one God consists of three distinct persons, and Jesus is the second person in that one God. And so they wouldn't say that Jesus and God are the same, but that is a common fallacy that needs to be discarded. On the other side, Trinitarians will say that Unitarians think that Jesus is only a good teacher or a prophet. We get this a lot. And yet this is just certainly not true. To say that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, means he is an entirely other category that is greater than just good teachers or prophets. Now, both sides will make this particular straw man argument. My opponent is cherry-picking his evidence. We'll see various passages that will get used, and they'll get tossed out, and instead of actually engaging in those, you just say, well, they're just cherry picking the evidence instead of engaging a wider corpus of passages. But that's not a fair representation of what they're doing. They might be quoting passages that you don't like, but to misrepresent their motive by saying that they are just cherry picking evidence, that is really not fair. I don't even know how you would quote a variety of passages that doesn't look like you're cherry picking something, because everyone is gathering a variety of passages in order to supplement their argument. Now, some people will make accusations about the motivation of another person that also falls under the definition of straw man, because instead of dealing with their argument, it's possible to distort their motivation. You can say that someone is motivated by an appeal to tradition instead of actually dealing with their argument. You could say that, well, you're only making that particular argument because you're motivated by tradition and church councils and history, and in doing so, you're not actually engaging with their argument. You could also accuse someone of being motivated by a desire to ignore truth, or to say that they're not really being sincere in their effort to interpret Scripture. Neither of these things are loving or charitable ways to engage with someone else. We would not like it if someone does that to us. We should no longer do it to other people. Now, I noticed that in the Gospel of John, there is this common theme of misunderstanding, and I've got an entire series of episodes where we go through each of the various misunderstandings in the Gospel of John, so you can check the YouTube channel for a playlist on the Gospel of John and themes of misunderstanding to see all of them. But I'll give you one particular example here to where the opponents of Jesus do a textbook straw man of his argument. So in John chapter 8, verse 56, Jesus says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad." So Jesus says there in chapter 8, verse 56, that your father Abraham, that is the Jewish people, their ancestor Abraham, rejoiced to see my day. He saw my day, and he was glad. So that's Jesus' argument. But in verse 57, they misrepresent and misunderstand him. It says, the Jews said to Jesus, "You are not yet 50 years old, and have you seen Abraham?" Notice what they did there. They said that Jesus is claiming to have seen Abraham. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said that Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Abraham saw my day. Not that Abraham saw Jesus. Abraham saw Jesus' day. But they misrepresent him, they strawman him, and they accuse Jesus of claiming to have seen Abraham. And of course, the misunderstanding continues, as you know from the next two verses, and they pick up stones to stone him. Not because they understand what Jesus is saying, but because they misunderstand what Jesus is saying. So, strawmanning people goes all the way back to Jesus. And Jesus, I think, never stooped to the level of those who strawmanned him and returned the favor. He never did that. So, if we've looked at the definition of the straw man fallacy and we've examined some of the common straw man fallacies that are used both towards us and against us, we need to take some time to discuss how to avoid committing straw man fallacies. And that is our third and final point for this week. So, what are the ways to avoid committing the fallacy of the straw man? First, we need to be able to represent our opponents accurately. We need to represent our opponents accurately. We need to take the time to understand the actual argument that is being made. And in doing so, if we are able to, we can restate it clearly to the satisfaction of our dialogue partner. and make sure that we are fairly stating it before we offer a critique. We don't want to misrepresent them and to spend all of our time attacking something that they're not saying because they're going to respond and say, well, that's not actually my argument, you're just distorting it, and they're going to assume that you aren't taking the discussion very seriously. So it's very important to have an accurate representation of what our dialogue partners are saying. The second thing is that we need to address the real argument, the actual argument that they're saying. We need to focus on engaging the actual points that were raised by the other person. We don't want to engage distorted versions. We're just wasting our time. And in a debate, time is a commodity that you don't have a lot of. So you don't want to waste your time dealing with points that are distorted and straw men. You want to take the time to actually engage what they are saying. Now, they might be saying something that is confusing or difficult to understand, or it uses some language that might be logically inconsistent. And so the third thing that you can do in order to avoid the straw man fallacy is to ask for clarification. Get your opponent to clarify something. If what they're saying is unreasonable to you, or even if it sounds extreme, ask them for clarification to make sure that you understand what they're saying correctly. And this way, you're not misrepresenting them. You're giving them an opportunity to clarify and to make sure that both parties understand the actual argument that is being conveyed. The fourth thing you can do is to use specific quotations. Quote what they say verbatim. Use direct quotations from that person, directly from the source, in order to avoid misrepresentation. This is going to be really, really important, because if you're engaging them and they are saying something that is logically inconsistent, by quoting them, you are holding them to that particular argument and you are addressing it fairly. Now, they might take what you say and they might commit another fallacy called moving the goalpost, which we'll look at in a future podcast episode. But I think the most charitable way is to actually take what they say, quote it verbatim when you can, and engage that direct argument. Now, I also mentioned the argumentative tool of the steel man. The steel man is the opposite of a straw man. If the straw man is to distort an argument in order to make it look weak or silly so that you can easily knock it over, the steel man is to charitably strengthen their argument into the strongest possible case that it could be, and then engage it fairly. And the benefit of steel manning an argument is that you don't really deal with the parts of the argument that are not very strong. You're making it the strongest possible argument that you can possibly do. You're doing it in a way that shows your dialogue partner that you are respecting what they're saying, you're listening to them, you're valuing their time, and that you are engaging them to the best of your ability. Because sometimes it's difficult for people to convey what they're trying to say or what they're thinking. And so you can help them by saying, okay, I think this is the argument that you're making. Make it as strong as possible. Ask them if they are comfortable with this, and then you can engage that fairly. So instead of straw manning your argument, if you have the opportunity, you can steel man your opponent's argument. Now, it doesn't matter if your opponent is going to straw man you. You don't need to stoop to their level. You need to be the better person. But if you are in a debate setting, if you're in a formal debate and the moderator doesn't jump in and call foul for the straw man argument, it's important for you to point out to the audience that your opponent has committed the straw man fallacy. And you need to do this in your closing argument. Your closing argument, you are telling the score and you're saying these are all the things that you did and these are all of the points that your opponent has ignored. And part of that is pointing out the various fallacies that your opponent may have committed. So if they strawman you, don't respond in kind, but make sure that you point it out to the audience so that they can help keep score of what you and your opponents have actually done with their time. If you make an argument and they don't engage it, instead they try to respond to it by strawmanning it, then your argument goes through because it actually hasn't been dealt with. It was ignored. It was strawmanned. And make sure that your audience sees that, because most people don't know what the straw man fallacy is. They don't know when they do it. They don't know when other people do it. So make sure that you point it out when you have that opportunity. The last piece of advice that I would say, and again, this goes for anybody, whether you're debating theology or you're having discussions with other people, it doesn't matter what christological position you come from. I think the most important way to avoid committing the straw man fallacy is that we need to show respect towards those that we are talking with. We need to be charitable. We need to be loving. And we need to be constructive. If your opponent walks away from a conversation thinking that you have misrepresented his or her position, then they're going to be far more unlikely to engage with you in the future. They're going to say, well, I'm not going to talk to that person because that person doesn't listen to me. They just misrepresent my arguments. They just want to argue and debate. They don't want to listen. They don't want to hear what I have to say. And Jesus taught in Luke 6, verse 31, that we are to treat others the way they want to be treated. If you don't want what you say to be distorted and manipulated and strawmanned, then we also need to treat others in a way in which we charitably, constructively, lovingly, and respectfully make the point to not strawman what they have to say. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Join us next week as we examine another common logical fallacy, which is the fallacy of special pleading. The fallacy of special pleading. Please look forward to our next episode. If you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes, by giving us an honest review on iTunes, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. If you feel led to offer a financial donation, you can check out the episode description for a link to PayPal, or you can commit to a membership on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am your host, Dustin Smith. Until next time, please take care.